Welcome back to another video of mine. We're currently going through our series of classical music for beginners and going through each of the different eras. I fixed my wobbly camera this time, so hopefully it doesn't shake around like it did the last time. That was a pain to fix in editing. But we're back at it with a stable camera this time, and I've got my notes, and we're here to talk about Renaissance. Renaissance music is some of my favorite stuff. Renaissance and like early Baroque. I like some early Baroque stuff because I'm a choral music nerd. Surprise, surprise there, right? So let's start with the Renaissance and the Renaissance era. So last time we had a video in the series, we left off with the medieval era, and we kind of talked about how the last kind of major development in music history was this idea of like rhythmic techniques, which was where you'd have one like rhythmic phrase and you'd repeat that over and over and over again. And then also the idea of coming out of that organum technique, where you have, it's like early harmony essentially, but now we're having it with like 4 parts, and instead of having slower moving lower parts and fast moving upper parts, the parts are starting to become more similar. And it's there where we start with the Renaissance. So the Renaissance comes from that technique and starts to develop and change over time. It's a very, like the era before it, still moving very slow. So there's not a clear-cut answer as to where the Renaissance starts and where the medieval era ends. Because if you look up certain composers who are in this kind of transitional time frame, they're kind of listed both as medieval and Renaissance composers. So ones that I talked about last time, like Dunstable or Dufay, those composers are also sort of considered early Renaissance composers. So it's here in the early Renaissance when we start our transition. So the voice parts in a lot of choral music are now starting to become more and more similar to one another. There's not like a leading part. They all are pretty equal weight in comparison to each other. It's a slow transition at the end of the medieval going into the Renaissance. Sometimes you might find a few pieces that are more in the Renaissance timeline that still have medieval characteristics, and sometimes you might find more Renaissance-like music at the end of the medieval era timeline. So it's a big kind of, think of it like, you know when you color shift from one color to the next? You can't tell when it all of a sudden starts to become that color. It just all of a sudden you're like, oh wait, now it's that color, I just now noticed that. The similar kind of thing happens when we're coming out of the medieval and going into the Renaissance. And also, like I said in my original overview of all the different classical music eras, Renaissance ranges roughly from 1500 up to 1600. A lot of stuff does come before then, and a lot of stuff does last after that. But the main bulk of what we tend to talk about does last from around that 1500 to 1600. So basically the entirety of the 16th century. So we're not going to see quite as many changes in this era as we did in the medieval era, because for obvious reasons, the medieval era is a much bigger span of time compared to this one. So when we look back to this kind of transitional period between the medieval and the Renaissance, one sort of interesting thing that we notice is most of the composers that we're seeing are coming from this Franco-Flemish area. So mostly like kind of where like Belgium and the Netherlands and France are today. Not all of the composers are born here, like I was born here and I lived here and kind of thing. Some of them are coming from other countries, but most of them are staying in this region and are at least getting jobs in this region. It's pretty profitable for most composers of this time period, as you've got either big churches or cathedrals that are employing you, or a lot of French royal courts were providing a lot of jobs for composers. Because during this time period, if you're making money publishing any kind of compositions, you're usually doing it under the guise of a church, a cathedral, or a local chapel, or you're doing it for either like the big royal courts like the king, or maybe smaller, more local courts. But regardless, most of these composers are being employed from this Franco-Flemish region. Jobs exist outside of this region, but the ones that we see most notably are going to be employed in this area. So which means a lot of these early songs are mostly going to be using Latin text, or they're going to be writing chansons in French. And so similar to the previous era, the biggest kind of genres of music of this early part are things like masses and motets of like the sacred genre, with masses being the big major works that you might sing for a Sunday service, and motets being smaller individual works that aren't necessarily tied to any specific liturgical use. And then chansons are just a version of mostly any secular French art song. But just as the previous medieval era had this idea of the repeating rhythmic phrase, now composers are taking that concept and transferring it over to a more melodic use. So instead of just a rhythmic phrase being repeated over and over and over again, we're seeing actual imitation between the lines in a melody. So for example, you might start off a song with one line having this melodic idea. Then you might repeat that melodic idea in a different line. Then that line might get repeated again in a different line. And then it might get repeated again in a different line, and so on and so forth. And so there's this whole idea now of starting to have melodic imitation. So you just have this idea and phrase that's repeated over and over and over again, either exactly the same or relatively similar. And so the collaboration between these lines is starting to create more and more and more harmonies. And so like we had the organum harmonies before, now we're starting to have more slightly complexer lines being sung together. This is going to mean more dissonance, and where medieval composers might have really avoided this actively prior to this, Renaissance composers aren't as concerned about having dissonance in their songs. They embrace it a little bit more. And a lot of songs, especially the sacred ones, are also being composed mostly based off of pre-existing songs. So, for example, you might have a big mass that's based off of a pre-existing Gregorian chant, which means you took that melodic line of the Gregorian chant and used that as the basis for composing an entire mass. So that idea of imitation, we see that line being quoted over and over and over and over again, at least in little short fragments, all throughout the entirety of the mass. One really great example of a composer who used this technique a lot is Josquin. Josquin is probably the best composer example of this early Renaissance era from this Franco-Flemish region. He has probably one of the largest amount of works of his contemporary composers, and was one of the first people to constantly be referred back to as a good example of composing from people who lived after him in the later Renaissance era, long after he died. Like I said in my medieval era video, we don't really see the concept of reoccurring composers start to come about until the end of the medieval era, because we don't really have any people who are consistently writing over and over and over again, enough documents with their name on it for us to be able to identify reoccurring composers. But towards the end of the medieval and into the beginning of the Renaissance, we finally start to see notable composers popping up again and again. And Josquin was one of those who, in that transitional period, who really became influential for not only his contemporaries, but people who came long after he lived as well. But of course, Renaissance music had to grow outside of that Franco-Flemish region, and Italy once again started to grow to become its own center of music composition. Once we transition from the early Renaissance more into the middle Renaissance, now we start to see Italian music really start to take the forefront of where the central hub of all this music is coming out of. Franco-Flemish still composing music, other areas of Europe still composing music, but once we hit that middle Renaissance era, Italy becomes a major powerhouse, namely because of one big genre in particular, and that is the Italian madrigal. The Italian madrigal is a huge genre of not only this era, but also the beginning of the Baroque era too. It takes the world by storm, and it's no longer the sacred genre either. Italian madrigals are strictly about secular poetry of some kind. The words might be taken from some line of poetry, or the composer might have written them themselves, but it's never really about anything sacred. Churches are not going to be singing madrigals. Madrigals are similar to motets in that they're a standalone piece, and they're also almost always a cappella, but they're not about any kind of sacred genre. And madrigals become very, very, very popular, and people start writing them all over the place. Then on the other hand, we still have masses and motets. And now, instead of coming mostly from the Franco-Flemish region, they're now mostly coming out of Italy, with Venice and Rome being the two kind of major cities where most of this music is being composed. So now, most of our composers are being born and taught in the Italian region rather than the Franco-Flemish region. So before, a lot of Italian composers would be born in Italy, but then move to the France area, and now they're mostly born in Italy and staying in Italy. And also, composers of other areas are also coming to Italy to learn where to study. Because when you have that kind of centralized hub of composition and music, that's where all the jobs are going to be, and that's where all the teachers are going to be. So you're going to want to move to that area, and then of course you're more likely going to stay in that area if there's not as many opportunities in your own hometown. So we even sometimes will see German composers, for example, come to Italy and compose, and French composers coming to Italy and composing. And of course, these Italian madrigals are still having those same compositional techniques that we're seeing in a lot of the sacred music. So that imitation between the lines, that pretty even distribution of who's the major part, not one part sticking out over another one. You can sometimes have these more homophonic type sounding sections, but remember, the idea of chords really isn't a thing yet. So if you went to try to analyze the piece and try to figure out what chords it's creating, you probably might be able to come up with something, but you might also get just a bunch of fourth and fifth intervals and not really any particular chord in any specific spot. The harmonies that are being written are still pretty horizontal thinking rather than vertical thinking. So vertical thinking being the way that we tend to look at it today, with thinking about chord, 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 what kinds of chords are we creating as we go along, and vertical thinking mostly thinking about sort of melody first. And then when you create harmonies, it's about the relationship between the lines and the relationship between individual notes, rather than going, what does this create here? What does this create here? What does this create here? And so on and so forth. Another kind of common composing technique that we also start to see slowly come to the forefront is this idea of text painting. You might have heard about this if you watched my video about Carlo Gesualdo, where I talked about how he was this composer who was a prince and didn't really need to compose for money. But this idea of text painting is one where it's basically kind of like you have your words that you're singing, and then you sort of reflect that in the music. One really great example of this is Gesualdo's Io Parto. There's a section in there where he talks about his spirits being lifted. And before it was, he was sad, he was depressed, or the character who was singing this is sad and depressed. And so it's been like slow and almost mournful. But then there's a section where it suddenly goes, my spirits are lifted, and all of a sudden, all the notes just go all the way up. They just run these scales up all over the place, and it's crazy. It gets super happy and bubbly all of a sudden out of nowhere. And that's kind of that text painting idea. We also see a lot of duetting going on between the lines. This is another pretty common composing technique that you'll hear in motets, madrigals, masses, any kind of thing, where sometimes when you do have the parts split off into kind of those sections of imitation, you break them into pairs. So one line might have a line of melody, and then two other lines might have another line of imitation, and then another two lines might have another line of imitation. And it kind of creates this waterfall effect. And it's not always clear what the words are being sung when you're having these points of imitation, but it does create this really beautiful, pretty sound overall, and it's really lovely to listen to. But like I said, it sort of muddies the text a little bit. And that kind of creates a problem in the sacred realm of music. And that's because during the Renaissance period, the Catholic Church is having problems with one little tiny small little thing called the Protestant Reformation. So it's during this time that Martin Luther lived and was actually a composer, because he broke away from the Catholic Church when he nailed his 95 theses onto the door, where he was basically like, here are all my problems with the Catholic Church. And he broke off of the Catholic Church and took a bunch of people with him to start Protestantism. And of course, while it probably didn't seem like a huge deal at first to the Catholic Church, obviously over time it became a bit of an issue. And the Catholics kind of realized that, we should reconvene, and maybe there are some problems with our church that we need to address and look at. And so therefore, starting in about 1545, the Council of Trent came together, which was basically a bunch of leaders of the Catholic Church who came together to talk about what can be reformed in the Catholic Church. So there was the Protestant Reformation, and then the Catholic Church's response to that was their Counter-Reformation. And this has a big effect on music. Even though there wasn't any specific rules for music must do this, 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 and this, there were kind of overarching general rules that the Catholic Church put out that did end up having a big effect on the music. And one of the biggest ones is that the Catholic Church really wanted to make sure that their music was intelligible by their congregation. It seems a little bit counterintuitive to us today if we're used to listening to music. It's still in Latin. It's not like a ton of people speak Latin, but they at least wanted their congregation to know what the Latin text was that was being sung, because this was sort of one of the critiques that Martin Luther himself had of the Catholic Church. And a lot of Lutherans, when they started off in Germany, sing a lot of their stuff in German rather than Latin, because it's the language of the people that it's speaking to rather than the language of the church. And the Catholic Church didn't let go of the Latin language, but they at least wanted the people to be able to understand the music. And so having a lot of that imitation in your polyphony made it difficult to understand the text, because this person's singing it and then this person starts overlapping and then this person starts overlapping and then this person starts overlapping, and it does really get jumbled together. It can be really difficult to understand the text. So we don't have complete and total homophony yet, but once this council convenes, masses especially really start to take on more of a homophonic approach. And one of the greatest leaders out of all of this rules and regulations from the Catholic Church was Palestrina. Palestrina was probably the biggest Renaissance composer you could know. Just if there's one name you have to know, it's him. Palestrina is the big guy here. And he writes a lot of masses and a lot of sacred music for the church, because he's kind of employed in Italy at this time for the church. And so he writes a lot of these masses with these kind of new reformations that the church puts out, that the church wants their composers to do. And he becomes a leader in terms of what works for the leaders of the church. That doesn't mean that all of the imitation is completely gone from all Renaissance music. It still is very persistent within the madrigals and the secular genres, and sometimes motets. But the big, really, really big, important sacred stuff is more starting to lean into that homophonic type sound. And then moving on into the late Renaissance era, that's where music really starts to spread, and it's no longer centralized. So all throughout the Renaissance era at this point, we've had some kind of hub of where you should go to learn music, where you should go to be employed if you want to be a musician, and where you should go if you want to learn any kind of composition. And as we get towards the end of the 16th century, it becomes less and less necessary for you to go find that centralized hub, because it really starts to spread throughout most of Western Europe at this point. Obviously, the Franco-Flemish area has been composing a lot of songs. They've been composing masses, they've been composing motets, they've been composing chansons, the secular kind of French art songs. Italy is still producing masses, motets, madrigals, and other genres. Spain starts to pop up, and while there was composers throughout the whole time period, it wasn't until the very end when we start to see some really notable composers coming out of Spain. Germany has a few notable composers, and there are several good German Renaissance songs, but we really won't see them become very big until more into the Baroque era. And then of course there's England. We haven't really talked much about England up to this point in either the medieval or the Renaissance era. And that's really because England's kind of weird with its music history. We'll see this throughout almost all the videos we'll talk about. England has a little bit of a problem with music. But it's especially prevalent in this Renaissance era because it's not until probably about mid-16th century when England even starts to compose Renaissance music at all. And that's because England was really isolated. Composers from England didn't go to the other places that other composers were going to learn about how to compose music. They just stayed in England. So they're not really familiar with the other kinds of progressions that are being made by France, Italy, Germany, Spain until about the middle of the 16th century. And then even at that point, most of the music that they're getting is just imported music from other countries. The music that they're performing there is still mostly foreign. It's not English music yet. And then of course comes the reign of the Tudors in England, and this causes even more problems for English composers. Because like I said, how the church had a lot of influence over music and how what kind of music is being written, if you know your Tudor history, you'll probably know how the Tudors affected the religion of England. So starting with King Henry VIII, that's where we first start to see the English composers coming to the forefront and starting to compose English music. King Henry VIII started off Catholic, so the composers are going to be writing Catholic music, but then he switched to Anglican, but he still didn't mind Catholic music. So composers in the sacred realm were mostly composing Catholic music. Then Henry dies, his son becomes king, and his son is mostly Anglican. So now everybody has to switch over to more English anthems and Anglican music. Because if you're composing Catholic Latin stuff, that goes against what the king is wanting, and you could get in big trouble. I mean, Henry had no hesitation for chopping his wife's head off, so why do you think the new king would do anything different? So you really had to be careful of what you were composing, because if it went against what the royalty wanted from you, you could be in big trouble. But of course, we all know Henry's son dies, and then Queen Mary comes to reign, and she is staunchly Catholic, like very, very, very Catholic. So she, of course, only wants Catholic stuff, and anything Anglican is completely out. So all that Anglican stuff you just wrote for the previous king is now out the window and can't be published and can't be performed at all. And then, of course, Queen Mary dies, she doesn't have any children, and Queen Elizabeth I comes to reign, and she is more Protestant, more Anglican. She's not completely against Catholic music, but she's not really going to want Catholic music being written because there's a lot of problems that she has with the Catholic Church. And on top of all of this, composers in England had to get a specific license in order to be able to compose. So unlike other countries where composers were just hired by the church or hired by the local court, the ruling monarch in England was the one who gave you your license to compose. So, of course, these changes in the monarchy are happening over a single person's lifetime. and you're going back and forth between Catholic and Anglican and Catholic and Anglican. And so anytime there's a new monarch on the throne, you have to throw all your old stuff out because now you can no longer perform that, and you can definitely no longer publish that. So being an English composer was very difficult at the time, and there was only sort of two major composers that really found a lot of success during this time. And part of that's also because they had a monopoly on their composition licenses. Because like I said, the monarchs could hand out composing licenses to whoever they wanted. And there was a brief period of time where two composers basically had an entire monopoly on all of English composing. And they were Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. These two somehow managed to live throughout most of the Tudor dynasty without ticking off any monarch and writing a bunch of songs and being really successful at it. But like I said, England is really far behind compared to the other countries that are surrounding it in terms of what they're putting out. So while other countries are composing in that very imitative polyphonic style for probably around 50 years at that point, England is just starting to get into it, and most of their references are imported rather than being native in any kind of way. And because of this, England develops its own version of the madrigal. It's pretty similar to the Italian madrigal, but instead of being in Italian, it's in English. Oh, and of course I forgot to talk about instruments. So I should mention, instruments were a thing of this time. They definitely were a thing of this time. Like I said, in the medieval era, we don't see a ton of music for instruments because typically instruments were not scored for, and a lot of the early music was coming from the church, and the church is not going to be having instruments. In the Renaissance era, the church is sort of starting to allow instruments, especially the kind of instruments you think of when you think of like the Baroque era, for example. So like especially things like the organ. But it's really playing that role as that background accompanying type instrument rather than being any kind of independent or individualized thing. And again, like the medieval era, most of the instruments that are going to show up in music are not going to be scored for. They can either play one of the voice parts or harmonize with the voice parts in some way, but we don't see a ton of instrumental music. But they are there, and they are playing a much bigger role than they were before. Like I said, some genres don't have instruments, and it's not just strictly sacred ones either. Italian madrigals are pretty typically a cappella and without any kind of accompaniment, but it is starting to become more of a thing. And then as we go into the Baroque era, we will definitely finally start to see instruments popping up. But during this time period, choral music is still very, very big and very, very strong. And as we move away from horizontal harmonies into more vertical harmonies, composing for instruments will start to make more and more sense. And then of course, really notable composers that you should know from this time period are people such as Dufay. I know I talked about him the last time in the medieval era video, but he can also be one to put in the Renaissance era as well. Because like I said, he really bridged that gap pretty well on either side. Josquin is another early Renaissance composer who came from that Franco-Flemish region and wrote a lot of kind of sacred music as well as many chansons. Josquin, who, like I said, was probably the biggest composer of that early Renaissance style and was very, very, very influential for all of his predecessors after him. He wrote many mass cycles and a ton of motets in addition to writing chansons and whatnot. Gesualdo is a unique guy, like I talked about in my Gesualdo video. His style of writing sounds very different. There's a lot more dissonance to it, and a lot more chromatic type sounds. So he's one if you want something a little bit different and a little bit more complex sounding, but a lot more of the Italian madrigal and secular genres. Giovanni Gabrielli, he's another really good one of that mid to late kind of Renaissance era, writing a lot of stuff for the churches, writing a lot of madrigals, He's a really good example. Obviously, Palestrina, I have to put him in here. Palestrina wrote a ton of stuff for the church and a ton of madrigals too. He just wrote a crazy amount of stuff. He put out so much work, and like I said, is a really good example of that kind, what that Council of Trent did to a lot of sacred Italian music. So if you listen to stuff that came before Palestrina, a lot of the masses before, and then the masses of Palestrina, you can really hear that difference in how that changed. Victoria, Thomas Louis de Victoria. I have to put him on here because he is one of my personal favorites. I got addicted to him thanks to my choral professor in university, and he comes from Spain, and I love his stuff. It is so good. I figured I'd throw a Spanish composer on here because I don't have any from Germany that were to stand out. A lot of German works tend to be more individual pieces rather than a specific composer, but Thomas Louis de Victoria is a really good example. So Spain is pretty Catholic, so he's writing a lot of Catholic sacred movements. So one really well-known piece of his, a lot of people know his O magnum mysterium. He also wrote a mass based on his O magnum mysterium as well. And then of course, like I said with England, Thomas Tallis and William Byrd. So these two composers, you can kind of put them hand in hand together. Thomas Tallis comes first and William Byrd comes after Thomas Tallis, but they did work together, and Thomas Tallis kind of taught Byrd. They kind of have a little bit of a mix of Latin stuff and as well as English stuff. Tallis has a little bit more of the Latin kind of genres than Byrd because most of Byrd's life was during Queen Elizabeth, and obviously she was very Protestant, whereas Tallis lived more throughout like King Henry up until like Queen Elizabeth, so he's gonna have a little bit more of a mix, but they still have a good selection of both kind of that Catholic and English Protestant type genres. All right, well, that was quite the long video, but I hope you enjoyed all of this rant, and I hope you go out and listen to the wonderful examples that I've given you today, and I hope you know more about the Renaissance era. It was surprisingly difficult for me to do research on this era, even though I still felt pretty comfortable with what I knew about it. I just sometimes had to be reminded of a few things and just double check that what I was doing was and saying was accurate. But it was really hard to find sources for this one, either because they were behind some kind of paywall, or they just like, I would look up search terms and it just wasn't what I was looking for at all. But I did my best and I found what I needed, and if you would like to see those sources, I typically now put them in a Google Doc that I link in the description, so you can check that out if that interests you at all. But anyways, if you're liking this series, feel free to subscribe and then probably ring the notification bell so you know when I put up the next one. I think the next video will not be one in this series. I think I have a little surprise video that I'm super excited about, and also kind of to give me a break from all this research. There's so much of it. But keep your eye out for that, and then obviously keep your eye out for the Baroque era video for when that comes out as well. And I will see you next time. Goodbye. Let's start with that. Shall we? Join me. Okay, I'm creepy. All right, back off, Lexi. Okay, hold on. I'm gonna let it go. I just read my notes and I thought this had a homophobic section. It says homophonic. Very different. Homophonic, homophobic. No, those are not the same thing. Where was I lefting off? Where was I writing off at? No, go away. But they at least wanted the congregation people, Victoria, Vittoria, Vittoria, mio cuore. That is England. Where's Thomas Tallis? Anyways, I will see you next time. Goodbye. Oh wait, hold on. No, wait. No.